File 1. The Confession. August 2009. Cliff Robertson was 85 years old when he finally said everything. Not to a journalist, not to a biographer, not in the kind of formal interview that produces the managed version of what a person wants to say about a difficult period of their life. He said it to a small gathering of people, a workshop, a seminar, the kind of professional event that the entertainment industry produces for the people who work in it, and that attracts the kind of audience that is genuinely interested in the craft and the business rather than in the celebrity that the craft and the business generate. He stood up. He was 85 years old, and he had the specific quality of an old man who has decided that the remaining time does not warrant the continued maintenance of a version of events that has been maintained for 30 years, and that the maintaining of it has cost in ways that the cost is no longer worth. He stood up and he said what had happened in 1977, not what had happened to him. What had happened, the full account, the account of what he had found and what he had done with what he had found and what the doing of it had cost him, and what the cost had looked like across the 30 years between the finding and the confession, and what the 30 years had contained. The people in the room were quiet. The people in the room were professionals who understood the industry he was describing and who therefore understood the specific weight of what the account they were hearing contained. Not in the abstract sense of understanding that the entertainment industry has a dark side, but in the specific sense of recognizing the particular darkness of what he was describing. He finished. He sat down. "Tonight, my friend, I want to open all the files, not just the one he opened in 2009, all of them. The file on what happened in 1977, and the file on what he found, and the file on what he did with it, and the file on what David Begelman did, and the file on what Columbia Pictures did, and the file on what Hollywood did, collectively, in the specific way of an industry that is organized around the management of information, and that managed this particular information in a way that should not be forgotten. Because this story is not only the story of Cliff Robertson, it is the story of what happens when one person in an industry organized around silence decides not to be silent, and what the industry does in response, and what the silence costs the person who breaks it, and what the breaking of it eventually produces. File 2. The Beginning. 1977. Cliff Robertson received a tax document in 1977. A Form 1-099. The specific form that the United States Tax Authority requires the issuers of certain kinds of payments to provide to the recipients of those payments and to the tax authority itself as the documentation of taxable income that the recipient has received, and that needs to be reported. The Form 1-099 he received was from Columbia Pictures. It documented a payment of $10,000 that Columbia Pictures had made to Cliff Robertson. The payment was for services rendered, the specific description that the form required for the categorization of the income. Cliff Robertson had not received $10,000 from Columbia Pictures. He had not rendered the services that the payment was supposed to be for. He had not had any transaction with Columbia Pictures that would have produced this payment. The Form 1-099 was for a payment he had not received for services he had not rendered. He called Columbia Pictures. He asked about the Form 1-099. He was told, in the specific way of large institutions responding to specific queries about specific documents, that the payment had been made and that the form was accurate. He was not satisfied with that. He was, by the accounts of the people who knew him and by his own subsequent account, a man who did not accept things that did not make sense, and a Form 1-099 for a payment he had not received did not make sense in a way that the corporate response he had received from Columbia Pictures did not make sensible. He began to investigate. This is the decision that everything else in this story follows from, and it is worth staying with it for a moment before we move to what the investigation found. Because the decision itself, the decision of a man in 1977 to investigate a tax document that most people would have resolved with a correction to their tax return and a conversation with their accountant, is the decision that defined the subsequent 30 years of Cliff Robertson's professional life in ways that neither he nor anyone around him fully anticipated when he made it. He was 53 years old in 1977. He had been in the entertainment industry for 25 years. He had won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1969 for his performance in Charlie, in which he played a man with intellectual disabilities who undergoes an experimental procedure that dramatically increases his intelligence and who then must watch as the effects of the procedure reverse and he returns to the person he was before. The performance was exceptional in the specific way of performances that require the actor to inhabit two completely different versions of the same person, and to make the transition between them credible and emotionally honest, and he had given it everything the role required. He was, in 1977, in the specific professional position of a man who has won the Academy Award and who is in the decade following the win, which is, for many actors, the decade in which the win's promise either translates into the sustained recognition that the win seemed to herald or fails to translate in the way that the failure to translate tends to happen, which is gradually and without a single definitive moment of failure, but through the accumulation of projects that are less than the win seemed to guarantee. He was working. The work was good. He was a serious professional who was doing serious professional work, and who was, in 1977, in the process of building the post-Oscar career that the Oscar had seemed to make possible. He was not in difficulty. He was not desperate. He was a man with a career and a reputation, and the specific professional standing of a person who has received his industry's highest recognition and who is building on that recognition. He had received a Form 1099 for a payment he had not received. He investigated. File 3. What the investigation found. The investigation found David Begelman. David Begelman was, in 1977, the president of Columbia Pictures. He had been the president of Columbia Pictures since 1973, and across the 4 years of his presidency, he had transformed the studio from a commercial underperformer into one of the most profitable studios in Hollywood. With a string of commercially and critically successful productions that had produced for the studio the kind of results that the studio's owners and investors had not seen for years. He was, by the assessment of the people in the industry who had the perspective to make the assessment, one of the most talented studio executives of his era. Not in the artistic sense, because the artistic assessment of studio executives is the assessment of people who are making commercial decisions about which stories to tell and how to tell them, but in the commercial sense, in the sense of understanding what the audience wanted and of making the organizational decisions that produced the films that gave the audience what it wanted at the cost that allowed the studio to profit from giving it to them. He was also, and this is what the investigation found, a man who had been systematically embezzling money from Columbia Pictures. Not a small amount. Not a single instance of the specific human weakness that produces a single bad decision. A systematic pattern of forging checks, of using the studio's resources for personal expenses, of the sustained misappropriation of funds that the word embezzlement describes, and that the subsequent legal process would document in the specific way of legal processes that document such things. The Form 1099 that Cliff Robertson had received was the evidence of one instance of this pattern. Begelman had forged a check made out to Cliff Robertson, had forged Robertson's endorsement on the check, and had deposited the $10,000 that the check represented into his own account. He had then, as a consequence of the mechanics of the accounting system, a Form 1099 had been generated in Robertson's name documenting the payment that had gone to Begelman. The check forgery was one of several such forgeries. Begelman had also forged a check in the name of the director, Martin Ritt. He had forged a check in the name of the actor Pierre Cossette. He had forged checks and had used the studio's funds for personal expenses and had engaged in the specific pattern of financial misconduct that the subsequent investigation, conducted by the studio's own auditors and then by the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, would document with the specificity that the documentation of financial crimes requires. Cliff Robertson took what his investigation had found to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. He reported what he had found. He did not take it to the studio being the institution that had been defrauded, and that was also the institution that employed David Begelman. Because the taking of it to the studio would have been the taking of it to the institution that had an interest in managing the information rather than in having the information become the basis of a criminal investigation. He took it to the district attorney. This is the moment. This is the specific moment from which the subsequent 30 years follow. And I want you to understand clearly what this moment was and what it was not. It was not the decision of a man who was motivated primarily by the desire to harm David Begelman. The accounts of his motivation, his own accounts, given across the years in the specific careful way of a man who has thought about his own motivations and who is trying to describe them honestly, describe a man who was primarily concerned with the specific wrong that had been done to him. A forged check in his name, a fraudulent tax document in his name, the use of his identity as the cover for a theft. These were wrongs done to him specifically, and he was taking the specific legal action available to a person to whom specific wrongs have been done. But it was also, and Cliff Robertson knew this and has acknowledged it, a decision that carried consequences beyond the specific legal address of the specific wrong done to him. Taking a criminal complaint about the president of a major Hollywood studio to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office was not a private act with private consequences. It was an act that was going to produce consequences for the industry and for the institution and for the person it was about. And those consequences were foreseeable in the way that the consequences of criminal complaints are foreseeable. He made the decision, he took the complaint to the district attorney. File 4. What happened next? What happened next is the part of the story that the Cliff Robertson who stood up at the workshop in 2009 was, for 30 years, telling in the careful way of a man who is describing something that cost him a great deal and who is trying to be accurate about the cost without being melodramatic about it. David Begelman was eventually charged with grand theft. The charge was for the check forgeries, the specific criminal act that the investigation had documented. The case went through the Los Angeles criminal justice system in the way of such cases, producing the specific sequence of legal proceedings that a criminal charge against a prominent executive at a major Hollywood studio produced in the late 1970s. He pleaded no contest. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation. He was required to perform community service. He paid a fine. He was not sent to prison. He was also, and this is the fact, that the story of what happened to Cliff Robertson requires the most emphasis, reinstated at Columbia Pictures. Let me say that again. David Begelman, who had been charged with the grand theft of funds from Columbia Pictures, who had pleaded no contest to that charge, who had been convicted and sentenced, David Begelman was reinstated as president of Columbia Pictures, not immediately. There was a period in which he was suspended, during which the studio's board of directors deliberated about what to do with the information that their president was a convicted thief. And the deliberation produced the specific conclusion that large institutions with significant financial interests in the continued operation of the people who have been making them money tend to produce, when the people making them money have done something that the institution's financial interests counsel for giving. He was reinstated, he continued, he produced films, he remained a figure of the industry. And Cliff Robertson's career began to decline. not dramatically. Not in the way of a single moment of exclusion that could be pointed to as the mechanism of the decline. In the quiet way. The way of an industry that does not send a letter or make a call or issue a statement. The way of an industry that simply becomes busy when you call and unavailable when you visit and somehow unable to find the role that your record says you should be receiving, for reasons that are never stated and that therefore cannot be addressed and that accumulate over months and years into the specific career trajectory of a man who has become, in the industry's management of him, the object lesson that the industry is using to teach the lesson it wants to teach. The lesson the industry was teaching in the specific way that industries teach lessons without saying what the lessons are, was this: you do not take the problems of this industry to people outside this industry. You do not take a forged check to the district attorney's office when the check was forged by someone who runs a studio. You do not make the private business of this industry the public business of a criminal court. You do not break the specific agreement that the people who work in this industry maintain, which is the agreement that the problems of this industry are managed within this industry and not outside it. Cliff Robertson had broken the agreement, not consciously, not as a political act, not as a deliberate statement about the industry's management of its internal problems. He had broken it because a specific wrong had been done to him, and he had taken the legal action available to the victim of a specific wrong. But the breaking was the breaking regardless of the intent, and the industry's response to the breaking was the response of an institution that does not distinguish between the accidental breach of an agreement and the deliberate breach, because the breach is the breach and the lesson is the lesson. He received fewer offers. The offers he received were for less than his record suggested he should be receiving. The projects that he developed and that he brought to the studios as a producer as well as an actor found the reception that projects find when the institution receiving them has organized itself around not being receptive. He was not blacklisted in the formal sense. There was no list, there was no official exclusion. There was nothing that could be pointed to as the mechanism of the decline. There was just the decline. File 5. The 30 years he worked. This needs to be said clearly, because the account of the career's decline that the Begelman affair produced can leave the impression of a man who stopped working, and Cliff Robertson did not stop working. He worked throughout the period, in television, in the specific category of films that were available to a man of his professional standing in the post-Oscar, post-Begelman period of his career. In the projects he was able to develop and produce with the resources available to him. But the work was not what the career that the Oscar had seemed to herald. It was not the work that a man of his talent and his record and his professional seriousness should have been receiving in the years following 1977. It was the work of a man who had been organized out of the specific tier of the industry where his qualities were most directly relevant, by the specific mechanism that the industry uses for such organization, which is the absence of the work that would have confirmed the tier rather than the presence of any single act of exclusion. He knew what was happening. He was not naive. He was too intelligent and too experienced in the industry to misunderstand the relationship between what he had done in 1977 and what the industry was doing in the years following. He understood the connection. He understood it in the specific, clear-eyed way of a man who has made a decision with foreseeable consequences and who is now living the foreseen consequences and who does not pretend that the consequences are unrelated to the decision. He did not express bitterness about it in the ways that bitterness tends to express itself. He was not, in the accounts of the people who knew him during this period, a man who was destroyed by what had happened or who organized his daily existence around the specific grievance that the industry's treatment of him represented. He was a man who was working and who was living and who was, in the private version of himself that the professional version was organized around protecting, carrying what he was carrying in the specific way of a person who understands what they are carrying and who has decided how they are going to carry it. He had the ranch in Santa Barbara. He had the flying. He was a licensed pilot, had been for decades, and the flying was one of the things about his private life that the public life did not always acknowledge. But that was a genuine and central part of who he was. The specific quality of freedom and competence and the particular relationship with the physical world that flying produces in the people who do it seriously. He had the life outside the industry that the industry could not touch, because the industry's power to organize the professional life does not extend to the personal life unless the personal life permits the extension. He did not permit the extension. He was, in this as in the 1977 decision, a man who maintained the specific boundary between what was the industry's to manage and what was his, and who enforced the boundary with the same calm, consistent determination that he had brought to the reporting of the forgery. The years passed. The industry changed. David Begelman did not remain the story of his own triumph over accountability. The subsequent decades produced their own account of David Begelman's trajectory, which was the account of a man who continued to make poor decisions in the specific ways that a man who has been told, by the outcome of the Begelman affair, that he is not fully accountable for his decisions, tends to continue making them. He produced films at other studios. The films failed. He lost his position. He moved to other positions. He lost those positions. In 1995, he was found dead in a hotel room in Century City, California, with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 73 years old. Cliff Robertson was 71 in 1995. He was still working. He was still flying. He was still carrying what he had been carrying since 1977, in the specific way of a man who has been carrying something for 18 years and who has arrived at the accommodation with the carrying that the long carrying produces. File 6, The Confession, 2009. Complete. He was 85 years old when he stood up at the workshop and said everything. I want to give you the full account of what he said, as it has been described by the people who were in the room, because the full account is the thing that the 30 years of careful, partial telling had been building toward, and because the full account deserves to be heard as the full account rather than as the summary. He said that what had happened in 1977 had cost him his career in the specific form that the career had been taking before 1977. He acknowledged this directly, without the softening that 30 years of careful public telling had sometimes produced in his descriptions of the relationship between the Begelman affair and the career's subsequent trajectory. He said the industry had organized itself against him in the specific way he had understood it was going to organize itself against him, and that the understanding had not made the organization less effective or less costly. He said that he did not regret the decision. He said this clearly and specifically, in the way of a man who has thought about a decision for 30 years and who has arrived at a considered judgment about it rather than an emotional one. He said that a wrong had been done to him and that he had taken the available legal action in response to the wrong, and that the response had been the response available to a citizen in a society organized around the rule of law, and that he had no apology to make for the use of the law for the purpose the law was designed for. He said that the industry's response had been the industry's response and that the industry's response was wrong. He said this without the hedging that 30 years of professional survival in the industry had sometimes produced in his public characterizations of the industry's behavior. Not wrong in the sense of regrettable or unfortunate or the product of misunderstanding, but wrong in the specific moral sense of an institution that organized itself against a person for the act of reporting a crime to the appropriate authority. He said that the specific lesson the industry had taught, by its treatment of him in the years following the Begelman affair, was a lesson that the industry should not be teaching, and that the teaching of it was one of the specific ways in which the entertainment industry organized itself around the protection of the powerful at the cost of the people who had less power and who made the mistake of relying on the legal system to address the wrongs done to them by the powerful. He said all of this. He was 85 years old, and he was saying it in the specific way of a man who has arrived at the point in his life where the things that were not said can be said, because the consequences of saying them are no longer the consequences they would have been when they were not being said. He finished. He sat down. He died in September of 2011. He was 87 years old. He died at his home in La Jolla, California. He had been a licensed pilot until he could not fly anymore. He had been an actor until he could not act anymore. He had been, for 60 years, one of the most capable and most seriously committed performers in American film and television. And he had been, for 30 years, the man who had reported the forgery. File 7, what the story means. I want to close this file with the specific observation that the story of Cliff Robertson requires, because the story is not only a story about one man and one studio executive and one forged check and the specific legal and professional consequences of the reporting of the forgery. It is a story about the specific way that powerful institutions manage the people who use legal mechanisms to address the wrongs that the powerful within those institutions commit. The mechanism is simple, and it is efficient, and it does not require any explicit statement of intent or any formal act of exclusion. It requires only the coordinated absence of the specific professional opportunities that the targeted person's record entitles them to expect, and the absence is produced by the industry's communication of its assessment of the targeted person through the channels that the industry uses to communicate such assessments, which are not formal channels and which therefore cannot be formally documented or formally challenged. It is, in other words, the precise mechanism that makes it possible to punish someone for reporting a crime without the punishment itself being the kind of act that the legal system can address. The crime was reported. The punishment was inflicted. The connection between the reporting and the punishment was real and was understood by everyone involved. And the form of the punishment was specifically selected to be the form that cannot be directly challenged, because it is the form of the absence rather than the form of the act. Cliff Robertson waited 30 years to say all of this out loud. He waited not because he did not know it, he knew it from the beginning. He knew it with the clear-eyed intelligence of a man who understood the industry he was working in, and who understood what his decision in 1977 had produced. He waited because the saying of it out loud during the 30 years when he was still in the industry would have completed the industry's work rather than challenging it. He said it when the industry's work was already complete, when the career that the industry had organized against was the career it was going to be, finished in the form it had taken, when the saying of it could no longer produce the consequences that the saying of it would have produced during the 30 years he had not been saying it, when he was 85 years old and there was nothing left for the industry to take. He said it then, and the saying of it, in the specific late hour of its saying, was both less than it would have been if it had been said earlier, and more than it would have been if it had not been said at all. He was right in 1977. He was right in 2009 when he said so. He waited 30 years. The waiting cost him what the waiting cost him. The saying was worth doing. And now, you know what happened. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see him on screen, in Charlie, in any of the work that the 60 years of serious professional commitment produced, see the man who stood up at a workshop in 2009 and said the thing that had taken 30 years to say. He said it plainly. He sat down. He was 85 years old. It was enough. It had to be.